Good morning, Vancouver. Thank you for showing up. I know it's early and you could be asleep and have told your boss that you are coming to a conference, but you didn't do that, so thank you for coming. I really appreciate being invited to speak here. I'm super excited about this topic because I love to talk about things that go wrong, because it's so fun when they don't go wrong. So this talk is called Y2K and Other Disappointing Disasters. It was December 31st, 1999, and a young sysadmin had just bet her boss that the systems were not going to go down. The stakes were her job. He told her that if anything went wrong, she didn't need to bother coming back because she was fired. But she, being young, really wanted to go to this party in Minneapolis, and she was in Des Moines, and that's a long ways away. However, she actually did it because she knew that nothing was going to go wrong. In 1999, we did a bunch of preparation and mitigation for what was going to happen. Although lots of you get pages, very few of you have actually ever carried a pager. Who here has carried an actual pager? Whoa, okay, I'm wrong. I am wrong. This is great. When you got a page, the thing you had to do was go find a payphone, and the payphone was located right at the entry to the club. So you'd be trying to troubleshoot a system, and all you could hear was like, oonts, 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 oonts. And you'd have to go in anyway, because we didn't really have remote administration the way we think of it now. So there was no way she was ever going to be able to get back in time to fix something if it did go wrong. Her boss said, what if something goes wrong? And she's like, it's not going to go wrong because I've tested it. And back then, testing and patching involved calling people on the phone with your actual voice and getting them to send you physical media that you had to put in a disk drive. And sometimes, because you were patching like phone systems or something, you had to like wire the disk drive in. It was the dark ages. So there wasn't any like push automatic update stuff. It's like with your fingers. Magazines were full of fixes and patches. We knew Y2K was coming. We knew what was going to happen if we didn't get this right, and we were really scared, and perfectly rational sysadmins bought property in remote areas of the continent and stocked it with diesel and like MREs. It was not an irrational response because, as anyone who works with the internet knows, what it actually is a collection of toothpicks and string and bubblegum and, as somebody said, angry badgers. The more you dive down into this, the more you realize that's true. So it was going to be bad if this went wrong. The further we get from the reality of Y2K, the more we realize, or the more we forget how bad it was, because nothing bad happened. Who here remembers the catastrophic economic collapse of January 1st, 2000? Oh wait, we didn't have one. It didn't happen. Nothing went wrong, but nothing catastrophically went wrong because we'd tested it. Utilities did fail, but they failed in like July, and they failed one at a time and not in a cascade failure because they were testing their systems. The SEC threatened to cut off all non-compliant banks. This is a pretty compelling reason to go ahead and update even though you don't really feel like doing it. Because if the SEC cuts you off, you're not a bank anymore. You're more like a cartel that happens to have some money for a little while. And we didn't really have a way to do push upgrades or mass upgrades. People had to program systems themselves. And that was a really difficult task. We talk about the moonshot and how much effort it took to get people into space. But what we don't talk about is that the Y2K effort was an order of magnitude larger. Millions and millions of dollars, millions of person hours. It was an enormous effort. And we don't think about it because most of us were not actually working at that point. Nobody remembers the crisis that we averted because we aren't programmed to remember things that are uneventful. Humans are programmed to remember things that are eventful. That's just the way we work. Like, if we burn ourselves, we try not to touch the stove again. But this didn't burn us. It's easy now for us to say that Y2K was overblown and that we were making a big deal out of nothing, but it was actually that bad, and we just managed to mitigate it in time. So that was all risk reduction. We knew that there was something that was going to cause a problem, and we did everything we could to prevent those problems from happening. We do risk reduction in all sorts of places. Like, we have vaccinations and anti-lock brakes and deer sirens and train gates. We're like, I would like a bad thing to not happen. That would be great. So what are the essential elements of reducing risk? How do we know what it is that we need to prevent? It's impossible to avoid all risk. You can't do it. We have to make trade-offs with risk, and we're actually not very good at evaluating what risk is. So for instance, there are a lot more of us who are scared of flying than who are scared of driving. But statistically, the drive to the airport is way more likely to kill you than the flight. But because we're irrational and because we have control issues, there are a lot more restrictions on what pilots and air traffic controllers can take when they have a cold than there are on us. Rather than becoming overwhelmed at the idea of trying to avoid risk, we need to break our world into zones and figure out what we can do to tolerate the risk in our zone or mitigate it. Because we can't control the world. We can't control the fact that we're a cyclist and somebody else is driving a 3-ton death machine, but we can say, I won't ride on that street, or I want separated lanes. We can say, this is where I want to be, where the cars aren't. So when we do that, we're reducing our risk. For example, as a way of reducing risk, I work directly on our API documentation, which is the same as our API programs. And when I'm adding documentation to it, there's every possibility that I could actually break our APIs by deleting or adding something that makes it not work. That's just a thing. And in order to mitigate this, in order to reduce the risk of this, somebody has to review my pull request so that I don't do something really stupid and break our system. That's a way we've decided to organize ourselves so that one person doesn't have the power to do something really tragic. Well, really tragic. There are a lot of risk reduction strategies, and they include feature flags and development branches and test instances and canary launches, and you're probably sitting here thinking about what it is you do to try and prevent things from going sideways. Another way to think about reducing risk is to predict the states that something can end up in. I am the English major most in love with finite state machines because they're awesome. Because what you say is, this is my beginning state. These are the possible states something could end up in, and here's how they get there. You don't need to draw an elaborate every possible branch state machine, but it is really useful when you are trying to mitigate risk to understand what it is that is possible and how something could end up in that state. So if you think that through, if you draw a little thing on your whiteboard about how it's going to end up, that's going to work out really well for you. Harm mitigation doesn't matter until something goes wrong, because risk reduction is obviously not perfect, or we would have no accidents. No matter how much we try to avoid risk, bad things do happen. That's why we have seatbelts and life vests, and why we install smoke detectors and sprinkler systems and doors that swing outward. Ideally, we don't have house fires in the first place, but if we do, we can design our buildings so we don't die of them. The most concrete, real-world example of harm mitigation that I want to look at right now is building codes. Building codes save lives. In 1985, an 8.0 earthquake killed at least 10,000 people and destroyed thousands of structures in Mexico City. Since then, Mexico City has increased its population significantly. It is also built on what is geologically essentially a bowl full of jello, so that anytime there is a quake, this filled-in lake bed continues to oscillate at a frequency that causes buildings to fall down. Since that earthquake, they changed all their building codes to be as earthquake-proof as possible, and they've even installed detectors that give people 10 to 15 seconds of warning before an earthquake. I don't know if you knew that was possible, but the low-frequency stuff that dogs react to before an earthquake, we can also sense that. And we just haven't spent the money to install detectors for that because mostly we don't worry about earthquakes that much, which we're in Vancouver, so I don't know why not. It's a thing. In the recent 7.1 earthquake, modern buildings survived well, and it looks like the death toll in Mexico City was 228 people. This is 25 million people living on an ancient lake bed, and they're doing fine. So this up here, that was a hospital in 1985. You can see that it is completely collapsed, and there's no standing structure left. They're standing on the roof. This is the worst damage picture I could find of the recent earthquake. That's an apartment building, and nobody died. It's just the corners. That's a pretty amazing change. 7.1 is a smaller earthquake than 8.0, but not that much smaller. Another example of building codes is a negative one. In the US, we have had some memorable disasters around fires, and it's seared into the cultural memory. When you see pictures of bodies piled up in front of a locked exit, it makes a difference to how you think about things. It makes an impression, whether it's the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory or the Ghost Ship Artist Space. The thing we've done about this is make rules about how clear egress routes need to be and how they're marked, and the doors open outward. If you are in a public space, the doors swing outward in case there is a stampede or a panic and people hit the doors. If they swing inward, they jam up against the doors and people die in the crush. If they swing outward, people survive. The hinges on your doors make a statistically significant difference to how bad a disaster is. However, the UK hasn't had the same kind of trauma that we have, and so it was perfectly legal to have a 28-story residential building that only had one fire stairway, and nobody checked that it was still clear. This is Grenfell Tower. We will never know how many people died in Grenfell Tower because we still haven't recovered all the bodies, and we never will. There were no sprinklers, and nobody did a test of the flammability of the exterior cladding they put on. It turns out that what happens when that stuff catches fire is it creates a chimney, obviating the construction design that was supposed to keep people safe, and it outgasses cyanide. It's not really something you want to put on the outside of a residential building, but the rules didn't say you couldn't, and it was cheaper. So even when you have almost identical cladding, this is the Torch Tower in Dubai. I might not have named it that, but hindsight is 2020. It is 79 stories, and it caught fire in much the same way as Grenfell. But because there were exit stairways sufficient to get everybody down, and because there were rescue areas, nobody died. 79 stories, nobody died. That's a pretty compelling reason to put in some better building codes. And when you think about risk mitigation, most of us are not working with life and death circumstances, but we are working with things that matter to us. So how do you mitigate harm? Well, first, you have to come to terms with the fact that you can't eliminate all risk, which is really difficult for us because we'd like to believe we could make the world safe. We can't. So you're going to have to assume that failure is going to occur. You have to know that. If you don't know how your product is going to fail, then you've missed something. Failure modes have different severity for different people. For instance, if my phone is exposed and my chat history is exposed to my partner, she will laugh at me for my emoji use. If somebody who is in an abusive relationship is exposed, they could die. That's a pretty serious failure case. And so while it's easy for me to think it's not that big a deal if my stuff is exposed, I'm not the failure case that we need to be planning for. In a software as a service setting, what may seem like a harmless bug around graphics could break business-critical reports. Or what seems like an urgent thing to you could be something that very few people actually use in production. Testers are the amazing people who never believe in the happy path. And we need more testers in our lives because the only way that we can lessen the impact of mistakes is to see them coming. So think about whether you want to fail safe or fail secure. When we build nuclear plants, we make them fail safe. We make it so that if anything goes weird, we drop the control rods and stop the process. If they lose power, they drop the control rods. If anything interferes with that, we're in big trouble, but mostly they're designed so they fail safe. Your computer, if you knock it off the table, most laptops now have a mode where they desperately attempt to save their data even as they're falling, which I think is amazing. It's pretty cool. So when you're thinking about what you want to do you want to protect data or do you want to protect humans? Is that a decision you need to make? So I already said I love state machines. Predicting possible states allows you to understand where you need to mitigate and reduce risk. The easiest path for software is the kill switch. If something is going wrong, how fast can you turn off your software or some part of your software? Are you going to have to redeploy? Do you know the Knight Capital story? Yeah, some people do. The Knight Capital story. They had 8 servers. They pushed out a deploy. One of them was wonky and was doing some bad data, so they went to redeploy, and they redeployed the bad one to the 7 other servers. And that was the end of that company. It just made millions and millions of dollars of bad trades at stock trading speeds. That was it. So can you safely and effectively kill your software? Because that's how you're going to be safe in at least one instance. It's the SaaS equivalent of a cat falling off a bed and then walking away with enormous dignity. Like, totally meant to do that. It was in the plan. Disasters or catastrophes are almost never the result of a single failure. They're a collection of small failures that the systems of safety we have to protect us from are supposed to catch. It's not ever just one thing, ever. And it doesn't matter whether you put the lid on your travel mug correctly until you start to drop it and grab it by the lid, right? The failure in the lid is only going to show up if you've had another disaster. So a combination of failures that causes a system to stop working is a disaster. Everything that you can think of, from natural disasters like hurricanes to engineering disasters, has several contributory failures. High winds and storm surge are fine until they knock out power or take off roofs altogether, leaving people exposed. Let's look at how the chain of failures can add up into a disaster. I'm from Minneapolis, and we had this bridge. It was lovely. It was the I-35 bridge. It's an interstate bridge going over the Mississippi. That was all great until it fell into the Mississippi River, killing 13 people. The primary cause of the collapse was the undersized gusset plates. They were half as thick as they should have been. But that didn't matter until we added 50 millimeters of concrete extra on top of the surface and a whole bunch of road construction equipment and all of the material you needed to strip off the concrete and pour another set. It's kind of a lot of weight to ask a bridge to bear. And it would have done it, even though it was in excess of the capacity, if the gusset plates had been to a specification. Engineers spent 18 months fishing this thing out of the river and taking it apart to figure out what happened. It was millions of pounds heavier than it should have been. There was corrosion in the trusses and bolts, there was extra construction and weight, and there was movement that in a orthogonal direction to how it was built to support things. And all of these factors together caused it to be fatally weakened. When we fish our own disasters out of the river and piece them back together, we find out it's the same. The cluster had a bad shard, which didn't matter until the cluster sharing failed, and then everything went down. We have to give Netflix credit for popularizing and toolifying the aspect of disaster that we can control. Chaos Monkey gives you a way to simulate things going wrong so that you can figure out ahead of time where your flaws are in a non-emergent situation while you can still think. If creative breakage shows up, then you know you still need to be mitigating because it's obviously not robust enough. So here are some fizzle factors that I'm going to go through pretty fast. Some general concepts to investigate about how to make things less disastrous and less exciting, because exciting is the enemy of getting to go home on time. Microservices and loose coupling. Not pets, not cattle, but bacteria. We need to think of systems as separate from their components and the components as disposable. Fault-tolerant messaging. One of the common mistakes we make in mitigation is that systems can't always talk to each other smoothly, or if there is a problem, it takes out the messaging. For example, a system could be down and the system down message could be hosted on that system, hypothetically, Amazon. And that's pretty unhelpful to tell people, like, everything seems fine. No, oh, actually, we didn't update the GIF. Storage is cheap. Make sure you have your data in more than one place because nothing and nowhere is safe. The Delta the Delta server center in Atlanta caught fire, and I take great delight in this because they shut down the redundant one in Minneapolis, and they were out for 2 days, and I'm like, I bet you wish you had a data center now, huh? Yeah. Canary launches. Test your feature in production. There is no way to simulate the distribution, the load, the message traffic, and the weirdness of production in test. Like, make sure, use a testing server, make sure it's not obviously flawed. But if you're not testing in production, you don't actually know whether something's going to work. So launch it to 1% of your people or 10% of your people and see what happens. See if there's a load spike. Find out what's going on. Humans are the slow and fallible part of almost any system. It's a great design system for preventing cascade failures, but it's also a great way to fail to respond to an emergency situation in a timely manner. If you have to call and wake someone up in order to stop a service, you have a problem. You need to make it so that if there's something barfing out bad data, it just stops itself and reboots, because I'm pretty sure that all technology is essentially a cranky toddler at heart, and sometimes it just needs a nap. Kill switches give us a way to shut things off quickly and safely without endangering ourselves or the system. Automatic recovery. If you have a run book for how to restart a system when it goes down, why? Please just automate that into a script so that it can restart itself. And if the second time it goes down, you need human intervention, that's great. But sometimes systems just go down, like a toddler, and you need to reboot them, and they're fine. Why insert a human into that system? Test for load, stress, and outage. You should absolutely do your unit and integration test before you deploy, but when you're talking about billions of messages, you're going to need to do something a little more. So make sure that you're predicting and using load to test your systems. So if this talk was too long and you read Twitter instead, here is the summary. Expect failure. Make your systems less rigid and tightly coupled. Plan for disaster because it will happen at some point. And degrade your services gracefully because it is better to serve half a page than no page at all, right? I was sent here by my company, Launch Darkly. We do feature flags as a service. And if you'd like a free t-shirt, you can take a picture of the slide and go ahead and visit that URL and we will send you one. Oh. If you have questions, we have a couple minutes. Yeah, okay. Sure, questions? You can also find me. I'm super easy to spot. I'll be around the whole time. And I will probably run an open space on feature flagging. Yeah?
What do you think about designing systems that fail closed?
What do I think about designing systems that fail?
Elevators as an example. The brakes are always open.
Right.
You cut power, they stop.
how do I feel about designing systems that fail closed, like elevators that automatically stop moving, because this is an aspect of the fail-safe or fail-secure. The worst thing that could happen if you lose power in an elevator is that you don't stop. It's not optimal to be stuck in an elevator that is stopped and trapped between floors, but it is way better than suddenly finding the bottom floor. So I think that when you're thinking about your disaster, you need to think about worst case scenario and figure out what it is that you're trying to prevent. And then, sometimes you'll need to break your system in order to keep people safe. That's just the way it is. People are always more important than the system. Any others? All right, like I said, you'll be able to find me.